everyone. Thank you, Niku, for that fascinating panel, and welcome everyone to the last panel of the day. On stage with me, we've got Chris Lehane, who is the Chief Strategy Officer at Haun Ventures. We also have Fred Wilson, who is the co-founder of Union Square Ventures, and Chris Meserole, who is Director of AI and Emerging Technology at the Brookings Institute. And as you may have guessed, this panel is on the intersection between AI and crypto. So maybe to kick us off, I was actually at another conference last week, which was focused generally on AI and crypto. And the overarching sentiment that I heard there was that excitement about crypto has sort of fallen away, and AI is going to overtake with all that momentum, and that's where all the eyes are going to go, and crypto is sort of just going to fall behind. What would your thoughts be on that, and if you can maybe capture in a nutshell the bird's eye view of the relationship and the intersection between the two? Chris, why don't we start with you and then go through the panel?
Great, thanks for having me. It's great to be with this august panel. Thanks for all of you for hanging in there. I know we stand between you and the cocktail hour, so. But to answer your question, I fundamentally believe that there are two major revolutions taking place in technology. Distributed computing, Web3 crypto, and then machine learning, AI, AGI. And I think as we go forward, those two technologies are going to increasingly intertwine and intersect with each other at a variety of levels, everything from how you document the accuracy of information to the usability of some of the technology, to even the economic systems that will exist within them, and we can get into that in a little bit more. But even above and beyond that, I think for the U.S. in particular, I originally come out of a policy background before I moved more into on the investment side. I do think that we're at a moment where we need to think about this, because the country or countries that really understand that these are going to be interrelated and how they sort of guide that and optimize for the benefits are going to be the countries that are able to project both their economic competitiveness and ultimately their values, as we go forward. And so for me, it's just absolutely critical that we think strategically from a first principles perspective about their relationship.
And Fred, Chris is talking here about how obviously AI and crypto in his mind might intersect.
I think if you think about it from the perspective of financial markets, you're absolutely right. I think these technologies kind of go in these hype cycles, and we had this huge hype cycle in Web3, and now we're definitely in the trough of disillusionment, and we're now in the full hype cycle of AI, and I think there will come a time when we calm down a little bit and realize that we're not all going to be working for robots in 2 years. So these markets go in cycles, but we're definitely in a bear market and a sort of a downturn and sort of disappointment phase in Web3, and where AI is going to solve every problem phase in AI right now. That's my view.
And Chris, from I suppose a policymaking and academic side of things, what's your view on both of these industries?
Yeah, well, I think to the point that Fred was making earlier, we've got two industries that have very cyclical patterns, right? Like AI has had boom and bust cycles going back to the late 1950s. Every few years it's kind of AI hype, then an AI winter, right? I think we're probably past the point of winters now. Like the technology is good enough that it's here to stay. But crypto, their boom and bust cycles have been a little more regular so far anyway, because of the Bitcoin halving and just kind of some of the impact that has, although I think it'll be less in the future. So I kind of think of it almost like two, for the tech folks in the audience, almost like two sine waves. And now they're I think increasingly going forward, they're going to be converging. And a lot of the innovation that happens on the AI side is going to be intimately related to some of the innovation happening on the crypto side and vice versa. And I think, frankly, it's really exciting. I think there's a tremendous amount of opportunity out there, both on an application side and on a policy side for innovation. And I think we shouldn't lose sight of that. And we should also, to the point that you were making, I think be a little bit level-headed about where AI is, but also be level-headed about where crypto is, and just kind of know it's going to come back in short order.
And should both of these spaces, marry down the line, as you've all explained, in practice, what does that look like for crypto? I mean, one of the things that we've heard, throughout this conference is that the blockchain, by virtue of being a public ledger, is transparent. It's easy to sort of track money. It's not so easy for a lot of folks, right? You have to have a certain understanding of the way that these technologies function. Might AI sort of impact the way that people can understand this tech from a crypto perspective more? And how does that impact not only institutions, but retail investors or folks that are trying to access crypto without an engine behind them, so to speak?
Well, right now, with self-custody wallets, the small number of us who actually use them understand that it allows us to control our assets, right? Not have them in a bank, but we actually have them, we control them. And I think we're going to need that for our data too. And I actually think that the way users are going to control their data, they're going to decide what models can train on my data and what models can't. And it's going to look a lot like the way a self-custody wallet is. I'm going to sign over the ability to access my data and apply AI against it. And so I think we need that. Users are going to need agency over our data in the way that users increasingly want agency over our assets. And I think that the software that the Web3 industry has built for giving us agency over our assets will be even more valuable in giving us agency over our data.
And I think there's 3 ways that AI helps crypto scale and makes it more accessible and usable to, I'll think of my mom who's 80, and she's interested in buying and selling Bitcoin, but has a real challenge trying to figure out how do you create and set up your own wallet, long numbers, all of that stuff. I mean, you can see a world where a bot does all of that for you, and you just basically have to speak into the bot and tell them what you want to sell and buy and how you want to set that up, and it does all the work. We were talking backstage that, using Fred's phrase, but it's almost like the UI. In my view, it's almost the OS. You think about HTTP allowing computer networking to actually happen. I remember in the early 90s, I couldn't explain what HTTP was. If I was asked to figure that out, I would not have been able to, but ultimately it was the platform that allowed it to power everything. And you could see bots or AI more broadly providing that function. I think secondly, I think one of the sort of superpowers of crypto is that it's ultimately going to create an open sourced ecology or ecosystem with all sorts of developers economically incentivized to participate in it. And AI is going to give them more building power to develop on top of it. And then the last thing I would just flag is I do think there's an interesting opportunity. One of the challenges with DAOs is the governance piece. The positives are the composability, but the challenges are the governance. And you could start to build into some of those smart contracts, what your governance structure is. I mean, this is pretty far out there, but think of sort of AI meeting the Constitution and actually creating a government structure so that you could actually effectively scale some of these. I think those are some of the ways you can see this play out.
And how would that, that sort of vision that you've just laid out, Chris, about the future between both industries, how does that impact, one of the key tenets of the crypto space today is trustlessness. You can access this and not have to trust a centralized party if that's what you don't want to do or want to avoid. If we have a world where your mum can access crypto trading through the help of an AI bot, somebody obviously has to design that, right? So how does that impact what is a very key ideological tenet for a lot of folks, and the reason why they get interested in crypto in the first place is to have this permissionless, trustless network? Does that sort of get eroded by the introduction of AI?
I think there's ways first of all, I think there's ways you can think about decentralized marketplaces within AI. I'm not sure that's your specific question. I think there's a second area here where the economics of crypto, plus the fact that it actually resolves the age-old conflict between privacy and identity. Again, something we were talking about, so Fred, jump in whenever, but we were talking about the potential for how AI and crypto will intersect on health issues.
But I think on the trust thing, you made a great point when we were talking backstage about the ability to audit this stuff.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's a couple of core challenges that blockchains solve when it comes to AI. One of them was one that Fred already mentioned in terms of data and data privacy and provenance, and your control over that data that goes into what is and is not allowed to be used to train a model, for example, or for the model to leverage. The other really important, I think, asset of merging AI with crypto and different ledgers is the transparency and auditability of any algorithm that's on a blockchain or kind of within a blockchain's ecosystem. I think that is probably one of the biggest missing pieces within the current kind of AI ecosystem as it stands. And I think it's to the point I was making earlier in terms of being a little bit optimistic about where this is headed. I think it's just a matter of time before we start to have robust, kind of user-friendly AI applications that are embedded pretty deeply within a blockchain, and that therefore you as a user can actually verify that your information that you're providing, not only do you have control over it, but that it's being used in the ways that you think it should be used. And that's something that's missing right now, but that I think we have a lot of opportunity
Fred,
to build
talking
out.
about your healthcare example.
Well, yeah, I mean, I want to second that point. Smart contracts are auditable. Like you can look at a smart contract and you can see what it's doing, right? Like we can all look at these smart contracts, and so to the extent that AI algorithms are going to be written in smart contracts, they have that benefit. The thing I was saying backstage, this maybe is a little bit of a right turn on this topic, is that healthcare in particular is an area where people have a lot of concern about their data being used. But on the other hand, I can't think of an industry where I would more want to give an AI my data to tell me if I'm going to die or not, right? Like, oh my God, I got this thing am I going to die, right? Like, the AI is probably smarter than the doctor, right? So I want to be able to do that, but I don't necessarily want to give it away. And so I think like the stuff that we have available in crypto is going to be really valuable in giving people the confidence to transact or whatever we want to call it with these AIs in areas like health, finance. There's one other area that I mentioned I thought was going to be where our data's financial data, healthcare data. There was one other. Anyway, senior moment. Can't remember.
Well, I think on that subject, it's an interesting discussion about the levels of adoption with all of this stuff, right? And that maybe the promise and value claim that AI will make in the future, but that's what crypto has been trying to sell for quite some time now. And I think most people, if they're honest in the room, who were really faithful on the promise of crypto just 5-6 years ago, would have thought that by today this stuff would have been more widely adopted than it is. And one of the reasons for that might be that a lot of folks maybe just don't find the idea of owning their assets on a blockchain as appealing as folks in the industry might make it seem. Is that something that's going to be a stumbling block for AI too? That you just laid out the argument for medical data and medical information, being ported over to this technology, but what evidence is there necessarily to suggest that the wider public, that obviously needs to get on board for wide adoption, are going to find that appealing?
Well, I guess the way I would answer that is, I think AI at some level is going to be sort of built in and integrated in the background. It already is at some levels. Maybe that's more broadly defined as machine learning, but it's already getting integrated and built into so many things. I think on something like as specific as healthcare, like if you know that you are able to potentially identify a disease early on or extend your lifespan by a certain number of years by participating in some of this, I think that's going to be a pretty powerful motivator. And obviously those are some of the promises and potentiality that AI represents. I think the point that I thought Fred made earlier and was really smart, is this idea that crypto could actually help you get the benefits of that without necessarily having to give away information about your identity that could be tracked back to you. And so I do think that crypto ends up helping to solve for some of the big problems that AI is going to create in those types of worlds.
And I suppose my question there would then be, is there a risk of AI being tainted with, again, rightly or wrongly, but there's obviously a big reputational blow that's hit the crypto industry in the last couple of years. If this stuff gets sold together, might that be a bit of a risk in terms of, folks that are very pro AI but maybe don't, care for crypto might think, well, I don't want to get involved in this because it's too hard to separate the two?
Yeah, I definitely think that the Web3 sector has a little bit of a bad name with a lot of people, and I think that's because honestly we haven't built stuff that changes their life one bit, right? That they look at and like, I got no value out of Web3. Like, there's nothing there for me, right? Mm-hmm. The minute that changes, I think people's views of Web3 will change, and for some people that was assets like Bitcoin and Ethereum. For some people that was NFTs. So I think the industry has largely failed to bring mainstream use cases to life. That's an absolute failure of the Web3 sector. And as you said, AI has gone through a bunch of those hype cycles, and then it didn't work, and it didn't work, and it didn't work. I think AI has now graduated to the point where it's, as Chris said, kind of built into so many different applications that I think people have just kind of accepted it. And I think that's what Web3 needs to do. And I personally think that'll happen in the next 5 to 10 years, and Web3 will kind of be in the water everywhere. But until we do that, it's going to be, I think, looked on poorly by a lot of people.
Yeah, and I'll just add really quickly, I think the difference maybe from an AI, which has, as Chris pointed out, since 1958, 1968, there's different dates you could sort of mark, but it's been around for a while before it sort of manifested itself in the way that we're seeing now. I think crypto, all sort of happened at once with a lot of eyeballs on it. I mean, even quote unquote Web 1 was a little bit more sequenced. And just the nature of, the small d democratic technology that underlies crypto meant it all happened at once before it was necessarily ready for those utility cases that Fred is identifying. All of that said, and I think this was talked about in some of the earlier panels, somewhere around 80% of the population in the US believes that the financial system needs to be updated. By large numbers, look at the idea of crypto being a solution to that problem. And then you just look at generationally how different people look. I mean, you still have 1 in 5 adults in this country that own a digital asset. And then generationally, folks under 40 with a very different view and perspective of crypto as a brand and what it represents prospectively than maybe an older generation.
If I can, I'd like to go back actually to that conference that I mentioned at the top of the chat that I was at last week, where most of these folks that I spoke to, they're involved in startups, they're web developers, they're very into the tech world. And again, the overwhelming sentiment was, crypto has had its chance, it's run its course, it's all about AI now. And there was no, apart from a pocket of people, there was very little sentiment saying that these two industries are going to marry in the way that you guys have been explaining. So, that's a very tech-oriented and aware, environment that I was in. So where's the disconnect, perhaps?
I think it's just like, Web3 has disappointed, and I think a lot of people now are super excited about AI. I think, people just, they get on the next train and they go. And, but what I can tell you is that in our portfolio, we've got probably 20 to 30 Web3 companies, and these companies are continuing to build stuff, and, they're going to make this stuff work better and better. And I don't see evidence that people have completely given up on it. I just think it's in a trough of disillusionment. That's my view.
Yeah, and my respectful pushback, and Chris, you should probably jump in here, but is I'm out in the Bay Area, I'm in San Francisco, which is really the epicenter of a lot of the AI development. I spend a lot of time with that community, as does Fred. And when you are talking with that community, they certainly look at crypto, blockchain, particularly blockchain ledgers, as being an important unlock and an important part of what's going to be part of AI. So I would say the folks who are actually in the space think a lot about this. I mean, you obviously have Sam Altman, CEO of OpenAI. I mean, he actually has, WorldCoin, right, which is a crypto project. And he specifically has talked about how he sees the relationship between WorldCoin being able to help, deal with the challenges of synthetically generated information, and how the ledger will actually help us solve for that from a provenance, ownership, authentication perspective.
And Chris, maybe we can go back as well. Just you've mentioned a couple of times the cycles of AI. Could you maybe explain why AI has gone through that kind of a history? Is it a case of the technology perhaps not being mature enough throughout history, or is it a case of there not being enough appeal for the wider public to take notice of it? What does it do with those?
I would say the reason it cycled so much was that the folks working on it could see the potential, but they suffered. In my view, this is just a kind of a pat answer. Human beings are not good at exponential growth and modeling what exponential growth looks like in their head and getting a sense for, if we have certain state of the art right now, what will it be in 5 years or 10 years, and what is actually required to solve a problem? The fundamental, I think, challenge from the 1950s all the way up to maybe early 2000s was a misestimation of how much compute and how much data storage it would actually take before AI and kind of the neural networks that, again, were invented 50 years prior, could actually be successful at scale in unlocking new capabilities, right? It really wasn't until you had a cloud computing infrastructure that was massively built out with AWS and other major cloud providers, coupled with internet scale kind of data sets, that you started to see AI really take off and the deep learning revolution really kick in earnest maybe 10 or 15 years ago, or the machine learning revolution kick in then. And once it did, you had kind of a hype wave of, again, even go back 10 years ago, right after kind of the first really popular unsupervised learning algorithm that, I think it was Andrew Ng who kind of had an algorithm that learned to detect cats all on its own. And there was this moment that, between that and like driverless cars, it was all like, we were all going to be in driverless cars by 2020, right? And they still got it wrong. I think we actually overcorrected the lesson that this thing, that we thought it was going to be so good, it never really kind of panned out. And then we've actually, I think with ChatGPT, had the opposite problem, where we just kind of assumed it was all going to be rhetoric. And it reached a tipping point between GPT-3 and GPT-4, where the order of magnitude increase that you had in computing power and data that went into that suddenly put it over a threshold where now, to get back to one of the points earlier about what is actually new with AI, I would say what's really new about it is not that we're going to have machines that are sentient and that are going to take our job, et cetera. What's new is that it's a new interface for computing, an effective one, right? You had the keyboard originally, then you had a keyboard and mouse, then you had touchscreen. What's really happened in the last year, in my view, is we now have computing interfaces that are basically natural language. And that opens up a whole new array, a whole new surface area for compelling applications. And I think that's kind of why we're at the moment that we're in with AI. I think it'll stick around. I think the hype cycle is kind of at the peak at the moment, and then it'll probably kind of die down a little bit. But in a couple of years, we'll be right back. The last point I'll say on the cycle is, the AI initiative that I run, we started that in 2018 and 2019, right after the crash in crypto, right when AI was having another moment. Then that inverted about halfway through like the life cycle of this initiative, and now we're back to the way it was when we first started. So I've already kind of lived through this.
We should just be investing off of your cycle.
Yeah, basically, right? Actually, don't do that. I think our lawyers would not approve. But yeah, it's very cyclical. That's why I don't think that we right now have really great use cases that are kind of already mature and scalable across at global scale right now. But to me, it just feels inevitable that that's where all this is headed, in the same way that it felt inevitable that eventually, whether it was GPT-1 or 2 or 3 or 4, it was going to cross a threshold where it really did become compelling.
So there's a lot of promise there for all of what AI might bring. Perhaps we can talk a little bit about the risks involved as well. Just last time I was on stage, we were talking about how the crypto industry presents certain national security risks to the United States and more internationally generally. But with the advent of AI and its potential, broader adoption, what does that do in terms of, perhaps making it harder to track illicit finance in crypto, or perhaps making it harder to understand the way that bad actors utilize, Web3 technology and other sort of innovations like that?
I mean, I would actually say that AI will make it a little bit easier to track some of the illicit behavior, just because of I think there will be a disparity between who has access to the best models and the amount of compute that they're kind of throwing at it. And I think for things like illicit finance, I think AI will be helpful. I do think that you're right, though, to flag that there are going to be very, very real national security concerns related to AI, and that will have massive repercussions, I think, for the intersection between AI and crypto. There's obviously things like some of the low-hanging risks associated with misinformation, some of the dual-use nature of AI in terms of you can use it to study making biocompounds and things like that. But one of the reasons why I actually think AI will increasingly integrate with crypto is actually for the national security, where the things are going on the national security side, where we've had, because AI has kind of reached this tipping point in terms of capability, and it's growing at an exponential rate, right? The amount of compute going in is doubling every 6 months, which is 4 times Moore's law, right? And if that continues through the end of this decade, the capabilities that these systems have are going to be immense. National security, policymakers are extremely concerned about that, which is partly why they've unleashed really unprecedented array of administrative instruments and regulatory measures related to things like export controls for advanced semiconductor manufacturing equipment, certain high-end chips. They're also exploring, again, very unprecedented measures like outbound investment restrictions on the ability of American firms to invest in AI firms within China, for example. The next kind of level after that, if what they're really interested in doing is denying capability, the kind of capabilities that are coming, that are currently here and that are coming in future versions of these large foundation models, they're going to have to figure out a way to introduce different forms of export control licensing regimes for access within China to some of these models in the United States. The reason I bring all that up, I know it's a lot to kind of bring in, but the reason I bring it up is I actually think the pressure that's going to place on the open source community to get some of these large language models and foundation models onto a blockchain that's fully decentralized will be pretty significant. And I think that's going to actually be one of the drivers geopolitically of why these two sources, these two kind of themes and trends within technology are going to increasingly merge.
So, we had, it was a month or so ago, the image of the Pentagon on fire, which was obviously synthetically generated. And I think that's an example, I think maybe where your question was also going, which is the perils of disinformation. And what you see being developed right now, in any number of places, including with mobile providers, is starting to think of ways that you can actually connect your hardware with the blockchain. So I think it's Canon, the camera company, don't hold me to that, but they're looking at developing cameras that will have keys that go right to the blockchain, right? That is in effect a watermark sort of at the front end. And then device can only allow that to be shown if it effectively has that built in. And so I think you're going to start to see technologies like that, and that's really where you see, I think at some level, the blockchain solving for some of these potential challenges. Again, this is somewhat speculative, but people are working on developing exactly those kinds of products.
The thing that you said, I think, that's very powerful that I remind myself of in times when I think, when I'm bummed out about the 10 plus years that I've been investing in Web3 and what we have to show for it. The number one thing about Web3 is it allows for censorship-resistant things, censorship-resistant money, censorship-resistant data, censorship-resistant software. The idea of taking large language models and putting them on a blockchain so nobody can deny access to them, to anybody, to a bad person or a good person, is such a powerful idea. That is why this technology is so important, and it's why it scares the fuck out of the government. That's why the government's trying to kill this industry here in the United States right now, because they're scared to death of it.
Can I just make one point? There's been a broad push within DC around the fears of what's called digital authoritarianism. And the point that Fred just made, I think, is probably the most underappreciated point when it comes to crypto, at least within DC, which is, most of it's all about kind of, is this a security or is it a commodity? I don't care. What a ledger like Bitcoin is, right? It's, in technical terms, it's basically a messaging bus. It's a censorship-resistant way of passing messages, right? You can attach value to those messages if you want, but it's a censorship-resistant way of channeling information around the world between actors who might not necessarily know each other or trust each other. That is a profoundly important piece of technology that we invented. I think it's as important as AI or even more important, because there's one future of AI development going forward. Again, I don't want to, whenever I talk about AI, I also caution people that if you're listening to an expert talk about AI, you're going to hear a lot more about their deepest hopes and fears than you are actually about AI. And I'm going to commit that sin myself. But the fear that I have with AI and kind of the worst case dystopic future is the one that's already being built in places like Xinjiang and is being built out in other kind of authoritarian regimes, where you have basically a robust digital infrastructure that you as an individual cannot avoid. Right, your financial system, your literal movements around a country, they're all being tracked and kind of incorporated into different AI systems. That's one really dark future for humanity. And I think the rallying cry that needs to be happening in DC, and in some circles it is how do we avoid that future? And I think, to Fred's point, probably the most important leverage point we have is censorship-resistant technologies. And this is probably the the best technology that we have that's in line with our stated policy to push back on digital authoritarianism around the world. I can't underscore enough how important this point is, and I think we got to get Fred down to DC to make the point.
Well, the problem is, in a country that values freedom over everything else, we have a central government that's trying to crack down on our freedom. Like, they're engaging in digital authoritarianism. The people in Washington.
Yes, and I would say, there's a whole debate to be had about how to regulate this. I also think things like CBDCs scare the hell out of me for exactly that reason, and I think
that's why China likes it.
Yes.
There are advantages if you are a digitally authoritarian regime to a CBDC. I'll certainly say that.
Well, but I mean, perhaps we can talk a little bit then about the way that the regulation of AI and the oversight of its development can perhaps undercut sovereignty issues and things of that sort. Like, in what way can we create this technology that you're describing that is censorship resistant, but also equally usable for bad actors and good actors? It strikes me as though that some folks will hear that and think, well, that's perhaps quite irresponsible, that we can just leave this stuff out there in the ether, essentially, and let it be used as and how by whoever has the skills to use it. There must be some sort of regulatory sort of buffer here that we can understand ways in which we can leverage this stuff for good and also sort of obviously minimize and mitigate the risks. Maybe you can speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing I want to be, hopefully it's very clear, I'm not calling for, the state has a massive and important role to play, especially, democratic states, right? I think what I would back up and say is, what is something like AI or crypto, right? They are fundamentally mechanisms for social coordination, like persistent mechanisms for social coordination. In a pre-digital age, we had a word for that, and that word was an institution, right? It could be an institution like Congress, an institution like the media, et cetera. AI is an institution that we're evolving effectively, somewhat similar to the media before it, in terms of we have the ability to distribute information at scale across society in an algorithmic way. The blockchain, Bitcoin Ledger, is effectively an institution for coordinating social action among parties who don't necessarily trust each other, maybe kind of globally, on other sides of the globe, et cetera. Those two things, when you think about both crypto and AI as institutions, I actually think that that's what's terrifying to a government, right? Because that's their calling card. We are the ones who are the institution that gets to decide how social coordination happens. I don't think that necessarily means that these two things need to be in friction. I think what's going to happen over time is we're going to learn and evolve ways, my hope anyway, within democratic societies, is that we're going to evolve ways where democratic governments are able to accommodate some of the new institutions and governance structures that AI and blockchains are going to afford. I do think it's inevitable that this will happen. If democracies are still around 100 years from now, I think one of the reasons they will be is they've figured out how to leverage some of the censorship kind of resistant qualities of these institutions in a way that's also compatible, with our democratic, structures and values. So I don't want to kind of go out on I guess the last point I would make, and I really want to be clear on this, I'm not saying that this government should go away or anything like that. I think that the government just needs to learn what the value add is of some of the new institutional kind of structures that are really, I think, about to be unlocked by these technologies, especially when they're combined in the way that I think they're about to be combined.
Yeah,
the two things I would like us as a country to demand of AI is that the algorithms and models be transparent and auditable to anybody, and that they be aligned with our values as humans and as a country and the things that we care about. And if we do that, I think those two things, if we do those two things, we're going to get 80 to 90% of it right.
And I'll just cut really quickly. I think fully agree with Fred. I think the challenge, and tracks back a little bit, I think, to Chris's comments, is that this technology does not really align with our current sort of processes, structures, and even functionality of government. I mean, if you think of cryptocurrency, almost at its fundamental, right? It's the first ever in human history global currencies operating at a global scale that are not backed by a sovereign entity, right? That's just really hard for government to get their head around. I think there's enormous opportunity if you're the US to even think about how you can actually use this to actually project and enhance the value of the dollar if you actually want to look at it offensively and proactively. But I actually just, even the processes of how our government works with a technology that is not built from an industrial age or an industrial age government, becomes really hard to figure out.
And on the subject as well of censorship resistance that we've mentioned throughout the chat, it seems as though there has to be like a bit of a balancing act where if that is indeed the sort of defining value of AI as some folks would perceive it, but it's also going to be falling within the oversight of governments. It strikes me as though that's not fully censorship resistant, right? There must be some sort of level of balance to be struck here, and it reminds me of a conversation that a lot of folks have with blockchain, which is, that the technology is value neutral. My personal view is that that's not necessarily true. A lot of folks that buy into blockchain buy into it because they value some things like privacy and peer-to-peer exchanges and things of that sort, and those are value judgments, rightly or wrongly, and I think that might also be true with the construction of some sort of AI technology, depending on its sort of the way in which it touches government oversight. Is there a balance to be struck there, and how can that be achieved while retaining that sort of central value of censorship resistance?
You know what the opposite of censorship is? Transparency, right? What we want is transparency. We want these systems to be visible. We want them to be auditable. We want them to be inspectable. We don't want them censored. Censorship is not what we want. We don't want things to be opaque. We don't want them to be hidden. We want them to be out in the open. This is the thing that we need. This is the world we want to build. We want to move away from a world where we control things and censor things and hide things. We want now I'm talking, Fred Wilson, utopian person, but the world I want is a world that's open, that's transparent, that's visible to everybody. And I think if we build systems that make that possible, then the bad people will get caught. The great thing about people who create crypto crimes is that they leave breadcrumbs that everybody can see. It's amazing. Yeah. We can track these people down. We can find them because they just are leaving their footprints everywhere. And that's what we want, I think.
Well, I think I'll pivot slightly to some questions that are coming in here on the iPad. One it's a good segue back into crypto actually, and crypto-related crime. One question here from the audience is: does AI present challenges for proof of humanity in crypto financial systems? So I suppose that question is alluding to potentially things like wash trading and bots used to inflate volume on an exchange for the sake of argument. In what way can AI impact that issue, and is it a good thing or is it a bad thing? How can AI be used on both sides of that fence?
Well, it's a little bit like teachers who say my kids are using ChatGPT to write book reports, and then those same teachers are using AI tools to find the kids who are using ChatGPT to write book reports. I think you can use AI to do wash trading, and you can use AI to find wash trading. I mean, it's just a new tool that we have to do both good and bad, and catch bad people who are doing bad things.
I would also just build on it. One of the points that I really appreciated that Fred made was around transparency, and I think when you think of, obviously there's been a lot of regulatory activity around crypto. There's just a great panel on it. There's also a lot of regulatory activity going on around AI. I'm skeptical that we're going to get much kind of significant major movement, but the one thing that Democrats and Republicans can agree on when it comes to something like generative AI and how it should be used is that if you are talking to a chatbot that's not human, but it's sounding human to you, that they have to disclose that, right? There needs to be some disclosure or proof of identification for these technologies. And I think that's where something like digital identities are going to be vitally important. I think blockchain, again, I could see a world where that's actually pretty integral to any mechanism we evolve for authenticating humans in a world where it's hard to tell whether you're interacting with a human being or actually just an AI agent on a server somewhere. And I think there's ways that these things work in, that blockchain can reinforce the transparency of AI, for example. And then, obviously there's ways that can work in reverse too.
Yeah, at a really reductionist level, you could build a hash onto the chain that sort of identifies whether it's a person or not, right? And the APIs sort of screen for that.
And on that subject as well of AI appearing as though it's a real human. One thing I think that's interesting is, and perhaps you guys can unpack it as well for me, is that the idea of AI, perhaps in its current form or its current level of innovation, is that it's learning from previous human experience, but there's a blocker beyond sort of obviously full sentience or whatever. How sort of much of a sort of block is that for AI innovation, and sort of are there the fears that we've got about that, it's sort of we're going to get taken over by robots kind of thing that we see on social media all the time. Like how overblown perhaps are those fears, or is there a sensibility to it, sort of thing?
I have pretty strong views on this, and I have some colleagues that disagree with me on this. But I think the fundamental question with AI in terms of its capabilities is it going to asymptotically approach human intelligence, or is it going to blow past it? Mm-hmm. And I would say with the current architecture we have, which is really the transformer architecture that's now maybe 5 years old, that architecture learns on data that, for the most part, it's gathered from the web. It might be curated a bit, but it's large-scale data sets gathered from the web, and it does an incredible job of modeling human language. And it does a good job of learning how to reason, or kind of picking up on the embedded reasoning capabilities that human beings have that's embedded in our language. I find it very hard to believe that AI, that's trained that way with the current architecture we have, is going to be able to perform at above average human, or kind of above human capabilities, if it's being trained on data that's, it's asymptotically itself limited by human capabilities. I think what would have to happen is that we somehow have some new architecture so that it's able to causally reason on its own, and it's able to operate in environments that are markedly different from the training data that it was trained on, and still be okay. I think that the facility that human beings have to be able to do that is we've got a really good causal model of the world. We just have an innate kind of intuitive one. We haven't figured out how to embed that in an AI system. And so I'm very skeptical, at least in the short run, that we're going to get AI kind of, again, I've got colleagues, one of my colleagues was on NPR the other day, and he mentioned he's not saving for college for his daughter because he doesn't think it'll be relevant by then. His daughter's the same age as mine. We're both 10 years old, right? And, which means he thinks by the end of the decade that this is kind of where things are going. And I would just, I love him to death, but I would fundamentally disagree on kind of the trajectory that AI is on. I think it's a very powerful one, but I don't think it's going to eclipse us in that time.
It sounds like you and your colleagues are the same as me and my colleagues. Inside USV, we have these debates, and there are people inside USV who think that the AIs are going to take over the world and control us, and I'm just not in that camp. I'm with you. And I can't even explain it technically, why I feel that way, but I sort of feel like humans have certain superpowers that we haven't been able to figure out how to give to machines just yet.
I always think of this as the Skynet question, right? And I would agree that we don't really have these self-learning, self-solving models yet, although as much of this conversation has focused on, short of Skynet, will this and can this be incredibly disruptive? I mean, this is potentially, at least in our generation or generations, first technology that could really have a pretty significant impact on white-collar jobs. And what does that mean for social stability? The disinformation and how that's managed. So while I don't, there's the line, right? Nuclear power could light the world, it could blow up the world. Like, I'm not quite there with AGI for a lot of the reasons articulated here. That said, I do think each stage of tech has been increasingly disruptive, and how are we thinking about this so we're making sure that we're actually optimizing for the positive benefits and mitigating those negative. And I do think those disruptions could really be significant.
Nuclear weapons is a example that I use when I talk, when we have these arguments inside USV. I often say that the fact that nuclear weapons are possessed by multiple countries, in essence, has caused us not to have nuclear Armageddon, right? And I think that's an example of when you put really powerful technology into multiple hands, it has this
balancing. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Perhaps, we've got a little over a minute left, so maybe we can sort of close this off with some very short closing remarks. Maybe go through the panel. If you can capture AI and crypto in
I've already said that you're going to get your deepest hopes and fears out of anyone talking about AI. I've shared some of the risks. I also would say that there's I think about my kids and I think about the future and where this is headed. And I think there's one future that if we get it right from a tech, the tech sector gets it right, the policymaking sector gets it right, there's really just an extraordinary kind of future ahead for us. And I'm excited about unlocking that future, but it's going to take conversations like this and both here and elsewhere to make it happen.
The only thing that I would say is that, in the 10 plus years that I've been investing in Web3, I feel like I've gone through 3 or 4 boom bust cycles. And what I've learned in those is to just keep the faith and keep investing. And that's what we're doing right now. And I'm pretty sure that's going to work out pretty well for us.
Yeah, and I'm ultimately very much of an optimist and do really believe that these two technologies are going to mutually reinforce each other and benefits. And what we'll see from health and science and education and economic opportunity could really be significant. The closest analogy I could use is imagine if network computing and mobile had happened at the same time, as opposed to different time periods. And that's sort of what's taking place right now. And like the innovators and developers and builders, and Fred, you see them all the time as well, are out there with incredible values and thinking about how they can use this technology to build for a better world. And ultimately, that gives me a lot of confidence.
Interesting. Well, I think we'll leave it at that. Thank you all for a fascinating panel, and thanks, guys. I appreciate it. I'll introduce Brett Tejpal from Coinbase to give his closing remarks. Thank you. Thank you.